The gravel drive at Dunstable Park was grey and wet beneath a late November sky, and the household had assembled on the front steps in their proper order, with the butler at the head, the housekeeper at his right elbow, the footmen ranged in a line behind them with their white-gloved hands at their sides, and their expressions of formal attention arranged for the arrival of a duchess. Eleanor Vane, Duchess of Carmore, descended from the carriage with her maid's hand at her forearm and the small, barely perceptible favoring of her left foot that she had long since stopped thinking about, and never managed to leave behind. The carriage accident that had produced it was 3 years past. The pain had resolved into something more like a companion than an injury, a slight drag on the left side that announced itself most in cold weather, on stone steps, on the first few yards of any new ground. She was used to it. She had learned to carry it without apology, which was the only dignity available to her on the subject. The butler, whose name was Carver, and whose face she did not know, bowed at precisely the angle correct for a duchess, and welcomed her to Dunstable Park with a sentence that contained no warmth and no discourtesy. This was the form, and the form held. She had spent 8 years inside the form, and she was fluent in it. It was the footman who undid her. He was standing third in the line, a man of perhaps 30 years, with brown hair and an unremarkable face that she nearly did not register at all. His name was John Holt, and she had known him briefly when she was 19 and employed in the Sefton household in Bath as a lady's companion, a position she had occupied for 13 months before the Duke of Carmore made his offer, and she accepted it because her father said she must, and she was young enough still to believe that rank would solve the problems rank created. John Holt had been a footman in the Sefton household. He had fetched coal for the companion's room, and occasionally, without being asked, placed a low wooden footstool beside her chair in the evenings when the stone floor was cold and the draught came under the door. She had not thought of him in 8 years. She had not thought of that room in 8 years. His gaze, as she passed the line, dropped for 1 fraction of a second to her foot. Not to her face, not to her title, to the slight drag on the left side in the cold November air, on the unfamiliar wet gravel. His face did not change. He did not speak. He was a footman at Dunstable Park, and she was the Duchess of Carmore, and there was no world in which he would speak. But she saw him look, and she saw him recognize, and she saw him arrange his face again into the proper blankness of his station, with a speed that told her he understood perfectly what he had seen, and what he must not say. Inside the entrance hall, before the drawing-room doors had opened, a footstool appeared near the chair beside the fireplace. Plain wood, low, positioned precisely where it would be most useful. No one had instructed him. She watched him place it, and she said nothing. She could not have said anything. There was a tightness in her chest that had no business being there, given that the day's purpose was to negotiate the terms of the Wayford mortgage with the Earl of Dunstable and emerge with enough left intact to keep her household through the winter. She was a duchess. She was here on business. The footstool was irrelevant. She sat down beside the fire and let her left foot rest on it, and the tight thing in her chest did not resolve. She heard Lady Ashby before she saw her. The Dowager Countess, emerging from the morning room with her silver fan already in motion, paused at the bottom of the stairs to say something to her maid in a voice pitched low, but not low enough for a corridor with good acoustics. The words reached Eleanor clearly. "The Carmore widow arrives today, and she wants money, or pity, or both, and I shall not give her either." A pause. She may have the east wing bedroom and the appearance of courtesy. Eleanor pressed her lips together and smoothed her cream-colored gown against her knees. She had known, before she came, that the welcome at Dunstable Park would not be warm. The previous Duke of Carmore had borrowed extensively from the Dunstable estate during the last years of his life, had involved the Ashby family's younger son in several schemes that had proved disastrous and had died leaving his widow a title, a mortgaged property in Wayford, and a reputation for the financial catastrophes of her husband as though they had been her own. The county had closed ranks accordingly. She was the Carmore widow. She arrived wanting money or pity or both. She had come wanting neither. She had come wanting the terms of the Wayford mortgage renegotiated so that the repayment schedule reflected what she actually had, rather than what the previous Duke had promised. She had come with figures. She had come prepared. She was not certain that prepared would be enough. If this story has already found you, if Eleanor's entry into that stone hall with its blanketed footstool already pulls at something in you, then let this story carry you the rest of the way. There is more to see here, and none of it is simple. Lady Ashby entered the drawing room with the full weight of a woman who has made every room her own for 30 years, and Eleanor rose to receive her. The dowager was perhaps 58 years old, and still dressed in the black and gold of half-mourning, though the younger son had died nearly 2 years before. The silver fan snapped open and shut once, the way a card is played. The eyes were dark and assessing. She said, "Your Grace," with the inflection of someone who had decided in advance what those 2 words would cost her. Eleanor said, "Lady Ashby," and met the dark eyes without flinching. They took tea in the drawing room. They discussed the roads, the weather, the state of the turnpike between Salisbury and Devizes. Eleanor drank her tea with the pearl brooch at her collar, catching the firelight, and said nothing about Wayford. Lady Ashby said nothing about George Ashby, the younger son, though his name was everywhere in the room, present in the black ribbon at Lady Ashby's wrist, and in the portrait above the mantelpiece, a young man with auburn hair and an open face, painted perhaps 5 years before his death. The Earl of Dunstable appeared at 20 minutes past 4. He did not knock. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his hand on the frame, taking in the room. And Eleanor looked up and had the distinct impression that she had been assessed and catalogued and filed before she had drawn her next breath. He was 35 years old, with dark auburn hair worn close and a jaw that might have been cut from the Wiltshire stone outside. His eyes were a sharp, particular green, narrowed slightly in the way of a man who has spent years looking at figures and finding them wanting. He said, "Your Grace," in a voice that was level and without inflection. She said, "Lord Dunstable," in the same key. They would meet in the estate office the following morning, he said. At 9 o'clock. There were documents to review. He was available at that hour only, as the afternoon would take him out on estate business. He said this with the brevity of a man who does not explain himself and has not been asked to. Lady Ashby's fan snapped open again behind Eleanor's left shoulder. He was gone in 3 minutes. In the corridor the next morning, on her way to the estate office, Eleanor passed the footman carrying a coal scuttle toward the library. He did not stop. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. They were 2 people in a corridor of different stations, moving in different directions, and that was the only way the corridor could work. She had lain awake longer than was useful the previous night, going over the figures she intended to present. £3,000 was the amount that would make the improvement to Wayford's drainage practical. £500 was the amount the first season's improved yield might reasonably return. The mortgage principal was £11,400. She had written these numbers on a sheet of paper and studied them until they stopped looking like numbers and started looking like a life she could manage, or could not. She had folded the paper and put it in her glove, the way a woman tucks a letter she intends to read again. And she had gone to sleep at last with the fire down to coals. The estate office was a room of shelves and ledgers, and a single window overlooking the kitchen garden, bare now. The beds turned over for winter, and the frost still on the soil at the edges. The Earl of Dunstable was already seated behind the desk when she arrived, and the desk between them was covered with papers that he had clearly arranged before she came. He did not stand. He said, "Please," and gestured at the chair across from him. And she sat down and placed her own papers on the edge of the desk nearest her, without asking permission. And he looked at them once, and she looked at him, and they began. He had the figures. She had known he would have the figures. What she had not fully reckoned with was the precision with which he presented them, without ornament, without the softening language that men sometimes inserted when they wished to seem kind while remaining unyielding. He did not wish to seem kind. He stated the amount of the principal remaining on the Wayford mortgage. He stated the interest accrued. He stated the payment that was due in March and the payment that would follow in September. He said that the estate's position did not permit restructuring, given the losses already sustained. He said all of this in the level voice that contained no pleasure in the saying, which was, she recognized, its own kind of integrity. She had expected to argue. She had prepared arguments. She had figures of her own, drawn from her solicitor's assessment of Wayford's income potential if certain improvements were made. She placed them on the desk between them. He read them. He did not dismiss them. He said that Wayford's current income would not cover the interest without the improvement revenue, and that the improvement revenue was projected rather than confirmed. He said projected revenue was not a basis for restructuring a mortgage, which was, strictly speaking, true. She said, it would become confirmed revenue if the restructuring gave her time to make the improvements. That is the nature of investment. He looked up from the ledgers. The green eyes settled on her face with a quality of attention that was not dismissal, something she had expected and did not find, and was something more complicated than that. He said nothing for 4 seconds. Then he said he would consider the figures, and that they would meet again in 2 days. It was not a refusal. She had come prepared for a refusal. In the corridor outside the estate office, she paused with her hand on the wainscoting and breathed slowly. The footman was no longer there. The house had its sounds, a clock somewhere and a door closing at the end of the hall. She stood there and thought about what had just happened, which was that the Earl of Dunstable had received her figures with a precision she had not anticipated and had not dismissed them with the particular ease with which men dismissed women's figures as a matter of habit. He had read them. He had said projected revenue was not a basis for restructuring, which was technically true, and then he had said he would consider them, which was not a refusal. There was a difference. She had been prepared for the refusal. She was not entirely prepared for the difference. The Wayford property was 12 acres of workable land and a house that had been in her mother's family before the entail stripped it, and it was restored to Eleanor by the terms of the Carmore marriage settlement, one of the very few provisions the Duke's debts had not consumed. It was not a grand property. It was the kind of property that required work and attention and modest investment to yield anything worth speaking of, and Eleanor had been preparing herself to argue for that investment in precise and practical terms, and she had made that argument, and he had not waved it aside. She was 48 years old in her bones and 27 in her body, and she had not let herself think, in the carriage on the way here, about what it would mean to lose Wayford. She thought about it now, for exactly the time it took to gather herself, and then she stopped. 2 days. She had 2 days. On the second afternoon, she discovered Mrs. Sowerby, not directly. She was crossing the back passage toward the kitchen garden because she had found that walking in the cold air organized her thinking more reliably than sitting, when she heard a voice through a half-open door. He was speaking quietly, with the compressed urgency of someone who believes they are not being overheard. The other voice was the steward's, a man named Birch, who had the sharp-eyed efficiency of someone who has been asked to recover an estate's finances and takes the mandate literally. Eleanor stood in the passage and listened. Mrs. Sowerby was the widow of a tenant farmer whose family had worked land on the Dunstable estate for 40 years. Her son had gone to the Navy and not returned from it. The rent on her cottage was 6 months in arrears. Holt had forged a receipt, signed with the steward's initial, marking the debt paid. The forgery had been discovered. Birch was informing him that the matter would go to Lord Dunstable. The eviction of Mrs. Sowerby would proceed by the end of the month. Holt said, "She has nowhere to go." Birch said, "That is not the estate's concern." Eleanor opened the door. Both men turned. Birch absorbed the Duchess's presence with the particular adjustment of expression that rank produced in people who resented rank and could not afford to show it. Holt went very still, in the way of a man bracing for a consequence he has chosen. She said, "What is the value of 6 months' rent on the Sowerby cottage?" Birch told her. She reached up and unpinned the pearl brooch from her collar. It was worth more than 6 months' rent on a tenant cottage, and they both knew it, and she placed it on the table between them. She said, "The matter is settled, and the receipt stands, and Holt's conduct in this matter will not be reported further." Birch looked at the brooch. He looked at her. He picked up the brooch. She walked back out into the passage and pulled the door closed behind her and stood in the cold corridor with her hands at her sides and the front of her gown, where the brooch had been catching no light at all, and she did not let herself think about what the brooch had cost or what she had left to spend. She had been in service once. She knew what it meant to have nowhere to go. She did not know that the door at the far end of the passage was not entirely closed, or that the Earl of Dunstable had been returning from the kitchen garden, or that he had heard enough to understand everything except the part where the brooch was one of the last pieces she owned. That evening, Lady Ashby arranged a small dinner. The county families were invited, among them the Pelhams, the Selbys, a curate and his wife, Miss Hargrove of Shropshire, who was staying with a friend in the village and had been included in the invitation with a deliberateness that Eleanor recognized immediately and filed without expression. Miss Hargrove was 22 years old and had a father with a solvent estate and the kind of uncomplicated prettiness that makes rooms easier to be in. Lady Ashby placed her on the Earl's right and placed Eleanor at the far end of the table, where she would be visible and not close. She was perhaps 3 courses in when Mrs. Pelham, a capable woman in her 40s with the particular confidence of someone who has been the most informed person in her village for 20 years, paused between spoonfuls of soup to remark to the table generally that the Carmore widow, she said, was here on business, of course. One heard there were debts to resolve. The old Duke had been so very free with other people's money. It was a mercy there was someone sensible at Dunstable now to manage the thing. The table absorbed this. Lady Ashby's chin lifted by a fraction of an inch, a movement of agreement rather than correction. Eleanor looked at her plate. She did not look at Edward Ashby. She had, at this point, looked at him as seldom as courtesy would allow, because looking at him created a sensation she did not have a name for and could not afford to examine. The green eyes, when they settled on her face, were not unkind, which was more unsettling than if they had been. He watched. He watched the room the way a man watches a fire, for signs of what it will do next. And she had begun to feel, in a way she had no business feeling, that she might be the particular part of the room he was watching for. She ate her soup, The dinner continued. He came to the library that night. She was there because she had not been able to sleep, and because the library was the only room in the house that felt, in some quality of air or arrangement, like a place a person might be honest. She had brought with her the battered volume of Cowper's poetry that she had carried since the companion days in Bath, her father's copy, with his marginal notes in pencil that she had long since memorized. She was sitting in the chair nearest the fire, with the book open and her left foot on the low fender rail, and she heard the door. He stopped when he saw her. He had a sheaf of documents in his hand, property papers she had left in the estate office. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she looked at him, and he looked at her. And the library was very quiet and very warm, and the candle on the table between his position and hers was the only light that mattered. He said, "I should not disturb you." She said, "You are not disturbing me." He came in. He did not sit at first. He set the papers on the edge of the table and remained standing, and she remained seated. And this arrangement was not quite correct for a private meeting between a gentleman and an unescorted widow, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved to change it. He looked at the book in her hands. He said, "Cowper." My brother read Cowper. George had a habit of carrying books he claimed he never had time for and leaving them face down on chairs. She said, "This was my father's. He read it so many times the spine is no longer worth mentioning." A silence. The fire moved. He turned toward the window and stood with his hands at his sides, and the line of his jaw was very clear in the half-dark. And she thought, with a precision she did not want, that he was a man who had been carrying something for a long time, and had made a practice of carrying it where no one could see the weight. He said, George believed what the Duke of Carmore told him about the returns on the scheme. I have spent 2 years trying to understand whether I might have seen it coming if I had looked more carefully, and I have not arrived at an answer. She said quietly, I believed what the Duke told me also. At 19. He turned back from the window. The green eyes settled on her, and the quality of his attention was different from anything she had yet seen from him, unguarded in a way that cost him something to allow, and she felt the breath shift slightly in her chest and put her hand flat on the book in her lap to steady herself. He said, You were 19 when you married him. She said, Yes. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, The Wayford figures. I have been looking at them again. The improvement revenue is not unreasonable if the first season's returns were applied to the principal rather than distributed. She said, That is precisely what I proposed. He said, Yes. He was looking at the Cowper volume in her hands and not at her face, which was perhaps why he said the next thing without catching himself. He said, You were a companion before the marriage, in Bath. She went very still. She said, Yes, for 13 months. He said, I know. I spoke with Holt this afternoon. She had not expected that. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the candle between them was very small, in a very large room. He said, I want you to understand something. Whatever the Duke was, the figure on the other side of this negotiation has not been, for some days now, the Carmore widow. She said nothing. She could not. Her mouth had closed of its own authority. He picked up the papers from the table. He said, Good night, Your Grace, and she said, Good night, Lord Dunstable. And he walked to the door and stopped there for a moment without turning around, and then he left. She sat for a long time with the Cowper volume pressed between both palms, listening to the fire. That is what seeing looks like sometimes. Not declaration, not gesture, not crossing a room. Just the quiet statement of what has become true, offered in a half-lit library to a woman who had not been certain anyone was looking. She let herself feel it for exactly the time it took the candle to burn another inch. Then she went to bed. Lady Ashby found her at breakfast. Eleanor had come down early, intending the small parlor, and found instead that the dowager was already there with her coffee and her silver fan, and a quality of settled intention that made the room feel like a site already chosen. She sat down. She accepted coffee. She waited. Lady Ashby set her cup down with the precision of someone conducting a maneuver. She said, "I understand Lord Dunstable spoke with you again last evening." Eleanor said, "He returned some papers." Lady Ashby looked at her with dark, careful eyes. She said, "You should know that whatever you imagine has been built here in 3 days is not what you imagine it to be. He is a man of great discipline, my son. He will give you reasonable terms for Wayford, because the figures support it." She paused. "Miss Hargrove of Shropshire has a father who is an old friend of Edward's father," she said, "and the arrangement has been quietly understood for some time." She did not say the Carmore widow this time. She said your position instead, with a delicacy that was, Eleanor recognized, a kind of cruelty more refined than the phrase itself. Which was this: "Your position makes certain things impossible, whatever a man of great discipline permits himself in a library at night." Eleanor set down her coffee. She said, "I see. Thank you, Lady Ashby." Lady Ashby said, "I say this not to be unkind." Eleanor said, "I know." She went upstairs and she told her maid to begin packing the trunk. She did not cry. She had not cried since the Duke's death, and she did not intend to begin now in a borrowed bedroom in Wiltshire, because a woman she had never liked had told her something she had already suspected. Lady Ashby was not wrong. She had said nothing Eleanor did not already know about how the world worked, about what a man of great discipline permitted himself, and what he did not permit himself when the morning came. The world had been telling Eleanor this same thing in one form or another since she was 19 years old, and she was accomplished at hearing it. What she had not expected was the specific quality of regret that arrived alongside it. Not grief, exactly. Something quieter and more practical than grief. The particular awareness of a thing that had been briefly possible and was now understood to be otherwise. She let herself sit with it. For the time it took her maid to open the trunk and begin removing the dresses from the wardrobe, and then she turned to the writing table. She wrote a note to him accepting the original terms. First-day terms. The terms before he had looked at her figures properly. The terms that would give her enough to survive, and not enough to improve anything. £3,000 for the drainage was a figure she would now find some other way to arrive at, more slowly, with more patience, which she had always had. She had always had enough patience. She folded the note. She pressed her seal into the wax. She set it on the writing table. Then she sat at the window with her hands in her lap and looked at the bare, late autumn trees beyond the stone wall, and thought about the footstool by the chair in the drawing room and his face when he placed it. And she allowed herself, for a few minutes, to understand that being seen, even briefly, even impermanently, was not nothing. It was not nothing. She had been correct to think so, even if the seeing did not resolve into anything lasting. The road to the turnpike was heavy mud by afternoon. The coachman said it would be passable by morning, possibly if the rain stopped. Eleanor said she would remain another night. She dressed for dinner in the plainest gown she had, a cream muslin with no trim and no jewelry, because there was no brooch left to wear, and the rest of the jewelry had been sold before the journey began, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Her maid offered the garnet eardrops, and she declined them. She went down. The dining room had been laid for 12. The Pelhams were there. Miss Hargrove was there, seated on Edward's right again, in a gown of pale rose that suited her uncomplicated prettiness, and the candlelight equally. Eleanor took her place at the far end of the table and kept her eyes on her plate through the first 2 courses and did not look at him. She was aware of him the way one is aware of something one has decided not to look at. The periphery of his presence was enough. He was attending to Miss Hargrove with the formal courtesy of a man discharging an obligation, and Eleanor told herself this was the correct interpretation of what she was seeing, and attended to her fish. Mrs. Pelham, the same Mrs. Pelham who had remarked on the Carmore widow at the last dinner, was seated 2 places to Eleanor's left. She was a woman who returned to themes, and she returned to this one now, saying to no one in particular, and everyone generally, that it was all so very complicated. The business with the Carmore estate. One understood there had been quite a great deal of difficulty. One was glad it could be managed so sensibly. The Carmore widow was fortunate, she supposed, to have the Earl's guidance in these things. Lady Ashby, at the head of the table opposite her son, lifted her eyes. Eleanor looked at the fish on her plate and did not move. Edward Ashby set down his wine-glass. The sound of it was quiet. The sound of it was precise, the way a period ends a sentence. He pushed back his chair. The room registered this before anyone had quite understood what they were registering, because the Earl of Dunstable was not a man who pushed back chairs in the middle of dinners, and the room adjusted its attention accordingly. He rose. He walked the length of the table. He did not hurry. He walked with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and has no intention of being uncertain about it. And the table watched him walk, and the table was very quiet. He stopped beside Eleanor's chair. She looked up at him. His face was the clearest she had ever seen it. The jaw set and the green eyes sharp, and a quality about his expression that she would not find a word for until much later, which was the look of a man who has finally allowed himself to see what he has been looking at for days. She is not the Carmore widow. She is mine. 10 words, delivered to the room, to Mrs. Pelham, to Lady Ashby, whose silver fan had stopped its motion entirely, to Miss Hargrove at the far end of the table, who sat with her soup spoon arrested midway to her bowl. To the room. Eleanor looked up at him and did not speak. She could not have spoken. The tightness in her chest that had arrived with the footstool on the first morning had dissolved into something that felt like falling, but slowly, and not unpleasantly, and she pressed her hands flat on the tablecloth so that they would not shake. The room held the sentence. That was what struck her afterward, as the thing she would remember most precisely, which was the way the room held those 10 words, the way a church holds a chord after the organist has lifted his hands, the sound still present in the stone long after the making of it was done. The candlelight. The faces. Mrs. Pelham's expression arriving 3 beats after the sentence did, as though her understanding of English had required translation. Lady Ashby opened her fan once, then closed it. She did not speak. Mrs. Pelham said something that nobody heard, because nobody was listening to Mrs. Pelham. Holt, stationed against the wall with the other footman, did not move. He stood perfectly still with his white-gloved hands at his sides and his face arranged in the correct expression of a footman in service. And if there was something in his eyes that was not correct for a footman in service, it was the kind of thing that only someone watching very carefully would see. Edward extended his hand. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. Then she placed her hand in his, and he brought her to her feet beside him. And they stood together at the length of the table in front of the assembled county, and Lady Ashby's stillness, and Miss Hargrove's arrested spoon, and the blanketed candles, and the November dark outside the windows. He did not make another speech. He did not need to. The one sentence had been the thing, and it sat in the room doing its work without assistance. He said, quietly and for her alone, "I saw you read the Cowper. I have been trying to find the right sentence since that night." She said, equally quietly, "That one will do." In the morning, the roads were passable. She did not take them. She was in the drawing room before 7, in the gray early light with the house still quiet, and the fire just beginning to catch in the grate. She had not worn the Duchess's posture yet, had not assembled the formal presence that the title required of her. She was simply a woman of 27 years, with a slight drag to her left foot, who was standing at the tall windows looking out at the bare late autumn trees and the wet stone of the Dunstable Drive and the low white sky. She heard the door, and she did not turn around, because she knew his step by this point, the way you know the step of someone you have been listening for, without admitting it to yourself. He came to the window and stood beside her, looking out. The stone drive, the bare trees, the sky going slowly lighter. Then he moved away from the window. She turned. He crossed the room to the chair by the fire, the same chair she had sat in on the first morning, and he bent and picked up the plain wooden footstool that was sitting beside it, and he placed it with the same quiet precision that Holt had placed it 3 mornings before, close to the chair and slightly angled so that the left foot would find it easily. He did not explain this. He did not apologize for it or offer it with any ceremony. He simply placed it where it needed to be and straightened up and looked at her. She said, "You spoke to him." He said, "The morning after you arrived. He told me about the Sefton household. He told me about the companion's room and the cold floor and the footstool." He paused. "He told me about your foot, about the accident." She said, "It is not serious." He said, "I know." He said it the same way he had said everything since the library, level and without ornament, carrying more than the words themselves. She crossed the room and sat in the chair and put her foot on the footstool and looked at the fire. He sat in the chair across from her. The fire between them was the only sound for a while, and the light through the windows came slowly on, and the bare trees outside became gradual rather than dark. She said, "What did you tell him?" "Holt." He said, "I told him his position was secure, that the receipt stands, that Mrs. Sowerby will not be moved." A pause. She looked at the fire. He said, "I also told him the brooch would be returned." She looked at him. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a small folded cloth, and inside it was the pearl brooch, and he set it on the arm of his chair without any further explanation. She looked at it. She looked at him. The pearl caught the morning light in the small domestic way of a thing restored to its proper place. She said, "You bought it back from Birch?" He said no. He said it with something in his voice she had not heard from him before, the very edges of something almost like warmth. And he said, "Holt bought it back. With his own wages. He had it waiting for me last night before dinner. I could not contrive a reason to give it to you at the table." She thought about Holt, standing against the wall in his white-gloved hands, watching the room. The slight drag of her foot on the wet gravel, 3 mornings ago. The footstool placed without instruction. The small radical act of seeing a woman who was not, at that moment, a duchess. She said quietly, "I was nobody when he knew me." Edward said he would say otherwise. She looked at the pearl brooch on the arm of his chair, catching the morning light, and the fire moved gently. and outside the windows the November sky came on slow and white over the stone of Dunstable Park. She understood, sitting there, that the season would not have her. The season had not had her in 8 years, and it did not intend to begin now, and she had spent those years carrying that fact the same way she carried the drag in her left foot, as a companion rather than a wound, with the daily ordinary courage of continuing to be entirely herself regardless of what the world had decided she amounted to. And now someone had looked. Not the world. One man. The man across the fire from her, who had gone the previous evening. To ask a footman how she took her tea as a companion of 19, and had learned instead the history of a cold floor and a plain wooden stool, and a woman who did not expect to be seen. He reached across the space between their chairs and placed his hand over hers. She did not pull her hand away. She turned her palm up beneath his, and his fingers closed around it. And they sat like that for a long while in the morning light, with the fire between them and the pale sky coming on outside, and the plain footstool bearing its small weight exactly where it had been placed. There would be contracts after this, a solicitor, letters. The Wayford mortgage would be restructured and the improvements made, and the first season's returns would be applied to the principal the way she had always said they should be. Lady Ashby would, in time, arrive at a form of acceptance that was not warmth, but was not hostility either, which was sufficient, and which was all Eleanor had ever expected from her. Holt would remain at Dunstable Park, on the morning of the wedding, small and quiet, with no county families and no silver fans, and a curate who did not mind the short notice. He would stand at the back of the room and watch with a face that was properly arranged for a footman in service, and eyes that were not quite correct for the purpose. No one else would notice. Eleanor would. But that was later. That morning the fire was enough, and the light, and the hand. The pearl brooch lay on the arm of the chair between them, its luster ordinary and steady, like all things that have found their proper place. If Eleanor's story stayed with you, leave it a word in the comments below. And thank you, truly, for staying until the end.